Hey guys, welcome back to my art channel. I'm Anastasia. Inktober is coming up in a couple of weeks, and I've been thinking about which supplies I want to use. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty obsessed with ink. The darker, the better. I happen to have a lot of inking supplies. Actually, I have nearly every item on the official Inktober supplies list. So, in this video, I'll be showing you all my favorite inking supplies, explaining the differences between each, pros and cons, etc. We'll go over fine liners, brush pens, dip pens, brush and ink, acrylic ink, India ink, gel pens, white pens, fountain pens, and ballpoint pens. I've tried all of these tools extensively and I have lots of thoughts on them, but I'll try to keep this video concise and packed with useful information. I'll also give a close look at what the tools look like in action and what kinds of marks they make, as well as whether they are waterproof and artist quality. Links to all of these items will be down below in the description box. Really quick, a word on inks. Broadly speaking, there are two types of colorant in ink, pigment-based and dye-based. Every ink consists of one or the other, plus a carrier or solvent. In general, pigment-based inks are superior for fine art, but I'll get more to that later. Throughout the video, I'll also have additional facts, stats, tips, and tricks captioned on the screen to supplement the voiceover and squeeze as much info as possible into this video. First up, we have our Fineliners, also known as technical pens. SAKURA PIGMA Microns were my first favorite pen, and they're extremely popular and for good reason. They're essentially a very fine felt tip pen containing waterproof, archival, fade-proof, pigment-based ink. The ink in these pens is very similar to India ink. They come in a range of sizes for fine lines or thick. Each pen has a small amount of line variation as well, meaning if you press lightly and quickly, you can get a thinner line. I've used this brand since I was a child and took my artist grandmother's set. They've never let me down. However, I have recently discovered another brand of technical pen, which I actually prefer. The Copic Multiliner SP is also archival, artist quality, fade proof, all of that, just like the Microns. They're waterproof and they're also Copic proof, which means you can draw over them with alcohol markers and they will not bleed. Even most waterproof inks will bleed when alcohol is placed over them because alcohol is a solvent. Not these. The SP version are the ones in the silver barrel, and those ones are also refillable and the nibs are replaceable. The reason I prefer them though is because I find them to be a little bit sturdier, so I get lines that are smoother and less shaky than with the Microns. It really is a matter of preference though. Just for comparison, I'll show you a fine liner pen I really like for writing, and it can also be fun for sketches. This is the STAEDTLER Tri-Plus Fineliner. While this brand has another line of artist quality technical pens, these are a water-based ink and they're not waterproof. However, I get a very smooth and confident looking line from this and I really enjoy it. Another fineliner I like for that same reason is the Prismacolor Fineliner or technical pen. This one seems to have a slightly more rounded tip, which means the line weight is incredibly consistent and smooth. If you find you really want your lines to all look exactly the same in width, and you don't really employ like a thin to thick technique when you're drawing, then I think you would love this pen. These are waterproof and artist quality, essentially same stats as the Microns. Here are a couple of drawings I've done with technical pens. The first one was done entirely in the SAKURA PIGMA Microns in various sizes. The second one was done with a Copic Multiliner, and the third with that Prismacolor Fineliner. Next, we'll talk about a different group of inking tools, the brush pens. Specifically, I'll show you some brush pens that have an actual bristled brush tip rather than a felt tip which has been tapered like a brush. First is the ever-popular Pentel Pocket Brush Pen. This pen has a lush brush tip that is capable of achieving extremely thin or thick lines. The ink flows nicely and the ink that comes out is waterproof. It's very similar to India ink in all of its properties and with its satin finish. I'll talk a little bit more about India ink specifically later. If you've ever seen artwork with sweeping lines of ink that go perfectly from thin to thick, then it's likely they were created with a fine brush dipped in ink or with a brush pen, which is essentially a brush you don't have to dip in ink because it has its own reservoir of ink, like a pen. Now I do enjoy the Pentel Pocket Brush Pen, but I actually prefer the Pentel Fude Brush Pen in extra fine. If the Copic Multiliner is my favorite overall technical pen, then this is my favorite overall brush pen. I absolutely love this thing. It does everything that the Pocket Brush Pen does, but the brush is a little bit less floppy, it holds its shape better, it can get finer lines, and it's much easier to control, at least in my opinion. The ink seems to be the same as the pocket brush pen, waterproof and very rich black ink with a satin finish. When buying this online though, make sure to get the Fude brush pen and not the black version of the Art brush pen by Pentel, which looks very similar but has a different ink. I do have one of those as well in the pink color, which I'll show you to compare. I just got this and I haven't used it much yet, but the color is so luscious. Another brush pen I really enjoy is the Kuretake fountain brush pen. This pen is very long and elegant and may even be easier to control and get even thinner lines than with my favorite, the Pentel Fude Extra Fine. However, this is a fountain brush, which essentially means it uses fountain pen ink, which is not archival or waterproof generally. At least this one is not. I learned that the hard way last Inktober. I usually want the option to add watercolor or marker over my drawings, so I actually rarely use this pen. However, if you don't care whether a pen is waterproof, or if you even want one that isn't waterproof so you can use water with it to get interesting effects, then this pen is amazing. The next two pens I have to show you are very similar. One is also by Kuretake from their Zig Clean Color line. These have very fine bristle tips and contain a water-based ink which can be used like watercolor. They can get very precise lines for details, but less of the dramatic swooping lines that I love so much from the other brush pens I've mentioned. I like this pen, but I've discovered that the Arteza real brush pens are a dupe for them at a much cheaper price. They look a little bit different, the bristles do, but they work exactly the same. In fact, even though the Arteza brush is larger, I find that the Arteza can get finer lines, yet also get thicker lines too. If you're thinking of investing in a few Kuretake Zig pens, I recommend you save some money and get a large set of the Arteza ones instead. They come in 96 colors too. To give you an idea of what kind of look brush pens can get, here are a few drawings I've done with them. Do you see what I mean about the confident and smooth, thin to thick lines? If I were to try to make those same lines by thickening my line gradually with fine liners, then they would lack that dynamic and smooth quality. That being said, there are artists that work that way and do an amazing job with it, but most of the old classic comic book artists got this effect by using a brush dipped in ink, possibly alongside a dip pen. Now, we are still on brush pens, but this is more like a brush marker category. The first is the Tombow dual brush pen, which has a regular felt tip barrel-shaped finer end and a long felt brush end. These are very popular among the modern calligraphy and hand lettering communities. They contain a water-based ink that can be used like a watercolor. I have a bunch of these in different colors and they are great for coloring in sketches quickly or for when I want to attempt hand lettering. However, the same company makes the Tombow Furenosuke brush pen. This is also a felt tip but much smaller and firmer. I have the hard type version, but there's also a softer one. This is meant for smaller calligraphy and hand lettering, and it's fantastic for that. It's also absolutely amazing for creating artwork. It uses quite a different ink from the Tombow dual brush pens. This one is waterproof and much darker. I believe it is a pigment-based ink. It's very similar to the Pentel brush pens I mentioned, or to India ink. I would actually recommend this pen to brush pen beginners, even over my favorite bristly brush pens. This sort of bridges the gap between a technical pen and a brush pen. It is so much easier to control and the ink is beautiful. Another pen that handles in a very similar way is the Pilot dual-ended brush pen. I love this thing. It has a black end and a gray end. I also really like this for calligraphy. The only downside is this ink is not waterproof and will likely fade over time. But again, that may not be a downside to you at all. It may even be a plus. I could see someone doing some really cool brush line work with the black end and then some stylized cell shading with the gray end. Really quickly, I wanted to mention that most pigment ink fineliner or technical pen companies make a matching brush marker. Here's the SAKURA Pigma graphic pen, which has the same pigment ink as the microns, but it has a nice tip which allows for very thick lines and varying line weight. They also make one that says brush instead of graphic, but that one frayed on me pretty badly and I tossed it. Now we'll talk about the classic inking tools used by fine artists and cartoonists for ages, and why many of them still use these today, even though more convenient tools have become available. First is the dip pen. This consists of a holder, which grasps a metal nib, which can be switched out for differently sized nibs. Ink is drawn up into the dry nib, which allows ink to just kind of hang there and flow from the tip of the nib to the paper in a capillary action. This provides enough ink for a minute or two before the nib must be dipped into ink again. This does slow the inking process considerably. However, once mastered, this tool can be more precise, more immediate, and more controlled than the best fine liners in the world. Manga and cartoons that are traditionally inked are usually done with a dip pen. I have this cheap set from Speedball, but there are many different kinds of nice holders and nibs out there. The other way to use bottled ink is with a brush. These two methods can be employed together, especially if you need fine line work and also large filled-in black areas. Using the same ink with two different tools enables you to do that quickly and effectively without any mismatched ink. If you want your work to be lightfast and waterproof, then I recommend India ink. This is the most commonly used ink for these tools. You could use a fountain ink or a water-based ink if you wanted to. You could even use acrylic ink, though I should warn you that that kind of ink dries quickly to a plastic-like solid, just like acrylic paint, so it's not very kind to your nibs and brushes if you don't wash it out right away. That being said, acrylic ink is very interesting and an underutilized medium in my opinion. It's basically a cross between paint and ink. Some colors are completely opaque, some are more translucent. You see this with paint as well. It can be mixed to get the exact color you want. They can be used for just waterproof line work, similar to how you'd use India ink, or just to color in a drawing like watercolor. The main difference would be that when a layer is dry, it cannot be reactivated with water. An extra little tip, if you don't want to shell out the money for an expensive brush pen, which will require lots of replacement cartridges, you can just fill a water brush like the Pentel Aquash water brush with India ink. This basically works just like a brush pen, but it's more cost effective. It could be another way to match inks also, particularly if you are combining it with a dip pen or the brush and ink option and filled this with the same ink for convenience. I used to worry that this would mess with the bristles on the brush after a while since India ink is waterproof, but I've had this one filled with India ink for almost a year with no problems. An option similar to the dip pen is the fountain pen, which has a nib very similar, but it has its own reservoir of fountain ink inside the barrel. This essentially has all the pros of a dip pen, but you don't have to take the time to dip it over and over. The major drawback here is that most fountain pen ink is not waterproof or artist grade, though some is. If you tried to put waterproof India ink into a fountain pen, it would likely destroy the pen over time. This one here is a cheap but effective fountain pen. The Pilot penmanship, also known as the Pilot Kakuno. You can vary line weight with incredible control, just like a dip pen. This can be great to sketch with or to learn inking with a nib on before moving to a regular dip pen for finished works. Really quick, I'll show you guys this dip pen in case you've seen something like it around and were wondering what it was. This is an oblique nib calligraphy dip pen. This works just the same as an old-fashioned dip pen, but the nib is offset from the handle. This is primarily for writing and calligraphy, and the reason that the nib is offset like that is it helps maintain a consistent slant in your script. Now for some more tips on matching your ink colors. Here is a nice thick Sharpie. A lot of people use Sharpies to fill in the black of their drawings. If your drawing will be scanned and edited digitally anyway, this can be great. However, I don't do this anymore. I find the Sharpie ink to be much more blue-black than most of the pens I'm using, and it also can get streaky on a wide area. Sharpies are an alcohol-based dye ink, and they bleed through paper too. Here I'll show my Copic multiliner ink and my Sakura pigment ink so you can hopefully see the color variation. Maybe this doesn't bother you, but it really bothers me. A better solution could be to use that water brush filled with India ink or brush pen to fill in a large area. Again, if you're using a dip pen, you could use the exact same ink this way. There's also the POSCA pen. This is a paint pen, not a true ink, but rather a very fluid, waterproof paint. I know some artists who fill in their solid blacks with this after doing line work with technical pens. It's nice and matte and waterproof. Personally, I don't love the way the surface of it looks, beside the smoother lines of technical pens, but that's just my preference. Next, I'll show you the white pens I use for highlights. The most popular method I see on YouTube is using a Sakura Jelly Roll white gel pen. This can be convenient, but honestly, it's not my favorite. The ink isn't very opaque, It tends to absorb some color beneath it and become dull. It's definitely not archival or meant for finished artworks, and it will likely yellow and flake off over time. The texture is very apparent to me as it sits in 3D above the paper. When you go over it to make it more opaque, it just gets streaky when the first layer is still wet, or it gets weirdly gummy and crumbly if the first layer is dry. That being said, it is super popular and super convenient, and if you like it, then that's great. I'm not trying to knock it. A gel pen I prefer slightly is the UNIBALL SIGNO white gel pen, only because the ink seems a bit more opaque and white. It still has all the same problems for me I listed with the jelly roll though. And mine has apparently run out of ink. Sorry about that. Now, a white pen that I do love is the POSCA paint pen in white. This is not a gel ink, it's a waterproof paint similar to acrylic, but much more fluid. It's more opaque than gel pens, it's waterproof and permanent, and there's less visible texture than the gel pens, but there is still a bit. It can be layered without problems. I use this for highlights in the eyes and just about every drawing or painting in every medium I do, except for oil paint. It works with everything. I've even used it in place of whiteout if I mess up an ink drawing. Whiteout and similar products tend to have way too much texture and I can't really stand them. An alternative could be white acrylic ink on a dip pen, but I find the POSCA to just be more convenient. For more subtle highlights over ink, a white colored pencil can be used. This one is a Faber-Castell Polychromos one, and I love the consistent finish on it. I also like the much waxier and thicker Prismacolor ones, which can be built up to be a bit brighter. Some people like to draw with black gel pens because the ink flows so smoothly and consistently. Very little pressure is needed to put down a nice, juicy line. For this reason, it's also difficult to get any variation in line weight, the way that you can with technical pens, but if your inking style doesn't require that, then that's not a problem, of course. I love sketching with gel pens occasionally. My favorites are the Pilot G2, which is not waterproof, and the UNIBALL SIGNO, which is waterproof. Both come in different rollerball sizes. I also like this teeny needlepoint Pilot High-Tech C in 0.25. This is great for very fine hatching and cross-hatching. It's so fine actually that it takes forever to finish a drawing with it. The downside to gel pens is that they're not really meant to create lasting artworks. They're usually not waterproof, although the UNIBALL SIGNO is. They're not really archival or fade-proof. Of course, this can be fine for sketchbooks or for work that you plan to scan digitally anyway, but as always, it's just something to keep in mind. I personally wouldn't sell anything drawn with gel pen. Here I'm comparing this water-soluble Pilot G2 gel ink to a waterproof technical pen ink. Now, the absolute most underrated inking tool is the ballpoint pen. The ballpoint pen is widely available, cheap, waterproof, long-lasting, and fade-resistant. Even though it's not meant to be artist grade, anything written or drawn with ballpoint pen lasts for ages. I wouldn't even hesitate to sell a drawing done with ballpoint pen. The ballpoint pen is essentially the only inking tool that can act similar to a pencil in terms of the range of value of each mark. Fineliners can appear lighter when you make thinner lines, but because the ballpoint pen requires manual pressure to get the ball rolling and distributing ink, the marks can be both thinner and actually lighter in value. When many light lines are laid parallel to each other, you can actually shade in a very similar way that you would shade with a pencil. You cannot blend out your marks or erase, but I actually find this to be a plus because it makes me very mindful of every mark I make. The entire history of the process of a drawing remains apparent, and there's something so immediate and beautiful about that. The direction of shading and hatching matters a lot because those lines will always be apparent, but this can be used to enhance a drawing with directional contour hatching. You'll see what I mean by this if you make sure you're subscribed to my channel and following me on Instagram, because, surprise, I will be using nothing but ballpoint pens for Inktober 2018. That's right, I have all this fancy supplies, yet I am choosing ballpoint pen. There is no excuse not to do Inktober if it's something you want to do, because you don't have a $10 Copic multiliner. You can do it with a free pen from your bank or from school. Here are some drawings I've drawn with ballpoint pen. Bold and graphic lines can be built up gradually with more control and smooth ease than fineliners, in my opinion. Alternately, directional contoured shading can carry a powerful message about form, light and shadow, and the drawing process. Colored ballpoint pens can be layered, which creates an optical illusion of blended color. This can be so fun to experiment with. Some artists even layer red, green, and blue lightly to create believable skin tones. Well, that's all I have to show you today. I hope you learned something or found this interesting. I've tried to give you a really close look at what each inking method looks like and how these tools work, how the ink lays on the paper, because these are things I personally am interested in when choosing inking tools. I hope you will subscribe and follow me on Instagram to see how my 31 days of ballpoint pen turn out. Like and share this video also to spread the gospel of ballpoint pen. Thank you so much for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.